Mira Thompson, a self-proclaimed activist and social media influencer, prided herself on calling out what she deemed societal injustices. One fateful morning, she spotted an elderly man at a coffee shop, dressed in a military uniform adorned with medals. To her, it symbolized violence and oppression, so she didn't hold back her disdain. What followed was a confrontation that shook her world. As the veteran quietly responded, his words unraveled Mira's beliefs and led her down a path of heartbreak and transformation. Mira Thompson walked into the bustling downtown cafe with her signature confidence. A 28-year-old influencer and self-proclaimed activist, she had built her brand on being unfiltered and unapologetic, tackling issues ranging from climate change to institutional inequality. Today, however, she wasn't thinking about her next video post as she scanned the room for a quiet corner to sip her usual oat milk latte. That was when she saw him. Sitting by the window was a man who looked to be in his 70s, dressed in a perfectly pressed military uniform. His hair was a stark white, combed neatly back, and he had a certain air of dignity about him as he held his coffee cup in both hands. Mira's attention zeroed in on the medals pinned to his chest. Bronze, gold, and silver flashed under the light, a small American flag patch resting prominently on his shoulder. She scoffed under her breath. To Mira, the uniform wasn't a sign of honor. It was a relic of a violent past, a symbol of imperialism and warmongering. She couldn't help herself. A sense of righteous indignation bubbled up within her. She grabbed her phone, flipping it to video mode. Her followers would love this. "Hey, everyone," she began in a hushed but conspiratorial tone as she filmed herself. "Just your daily dose of irony. A man flaunting his military accomplishments like it's something to be proud of. I mean, really, what do medals for war even signify in this day and age?" She stopped recording but didn't put the phone away. Instead, she strode over to his table, her boots clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The cafe, which had been alive with murmured conversations, seemed to quiet as if sensing the confrontation about to unfold. "Excuse me," Mira said, her tone loud enough to turn a few heads. "I couldn't help but notice your uniform." The man looked up from his coffee, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to look right through her. His expression was calm, almost serene, as though he had faced far worse than a stranger's judgment. "Yes, miss," he replied, his voice gravelly but steady. Mira crossed her arms. "I just have to ask, do you really think wearing that uniform makes you some kind of hero? Like, do you realize how many lives were ruined by wars fought in the name of those medals you're wearing?" The man set his cup down gently, folding his hands on the table. He didn't speak immediately, and the silence stretched long enough for Mira to feel a flicker of discomfort. Still, she held her ground, determined to expose what she saw as hypocrisy. Finally, he said, "Miss, I'm not sure what you think you know about me, but I'll answer your question if you'll indulge me for a few minutes." Mira hesitated. She had expected anger or defensiveness, but his calm demeanor threw her off balance. She glanced around and noticed that nearly everyone in the cafe was now watching them. Perfect. If he wanted to justify himself, she'd let him, right before dismantling his argument. "Fine," she said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. She set her phone on the table, ready to record if he said something particularly incriminating. "Go ahead." The man leaned back slightly, studying her for a moment. Then he spoke. "My name is Colonel Arthur Miles. I served in the United States Army for 35 years. I fought in Vietnam, among other places. But you didn't come here to listen to my resume. So let me tell you a story instead." Mira rolled her eyes but motioned for him to continue. "This was back in 1969, Arthur began. I was stationed near a small village in Vietnam, not far from the Cambodian border. One night, our unit received word that the village was going to be attacked by enemy forces. We were ordered to evacuate the civilians before dawn." He paused, his gaze drifting to some unseen horizon, and Mira found herself leaning forward despite herself. "We didn't make it in time," he said quietly. When we arrived, the village was already under siege. Fires were everywhere. People were running, screaming. It was chaos. In the middle of it all, I saw a little girl, couldn't have been older than 6, standing by herself, crying. Her house was in flames and her family, well, they didn't make it. Mira swallowed hard, the vivid imagery catching her off guard. "I couldn't leave her there," Arthur continued. "I grabbed her and carried her on my back for miles through the jungle until we reached safety. Along the way, we were ambushed twice. I lost one of my closest friends that night, a man I considered a brother. But that little girl survived. She was the only one from her family who did." He stopped speaking, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mira was stunned into silence, her earlier confidence shaken. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He slid it across the table to her. The picture was of a young woman in a white coat, holding a stethoscope. She had a radiant smile and her eyes were full of life. "That's her," Arthur said. "She grew up, became a doctor. She saved countless lives since then, and all because someone saved hers." Mira stared at the photo, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to call him out for glorifying war, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar ache in her chest. A twinge of guilt, perhaps, or something deeper. Arthur leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You don't have to agree with the wars I fought in, Miss Thompson. Hell, I don't agree with all of them myself. But service is about more than the politics of war. It's about the people you protect, the lives you touch, and sometimes it's about making the best choice in a world full of bad ones." For the first time, Mira didn't have a snappy comeback. She sat there, staring at the man she had judged so harshly, and felt the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Mira sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The words of Colonel Arthur Miles hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. She had entered the cafe ready for a fight, a debate to put another symbol of oppression in his place. Yet here she was, struggling to come up with even a single coherent retort. And worse, a small part of her wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, she had been wrong. But no. Mira wouldn't admit that. Not yet, anyway. She straightened her back, locking eyes with Arthur, who now sipped his coffee with a patience that only years of experience could produce. "So," she began, her voice sharp, "you saved one girl. And what? That's supposed to excuse everything else? What about all the others who weren't saved? What about the villages burned to the ground? The people you couldn't carry on your back?" Arthur set his cup down, his weathered hands clasping in front of him. "I won't argue with you on that. War is hell, Miss Thompson. It's cruel, unforgiving, and often senseless. And those medals you see?" He gestured to the rows of ribbons on his chest. "They aren't prizes, they're reminders. Each one represents a mission, and every mission came with a cost. Sometimes that cost was too high." Mira's jaw tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but he continued before she could interject. "Let me tell you about the first medal I ever received," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly. "It was 1958. I was a young man, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself. Back then, I thought the uniform meant glory. I thought it meant respect. But I learned very quickly that it didn't." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the window as if seeing a distant memory. "We were stationed in a small base in Germany during the Cold War. It was a time of tension, uncertainty. I was assigned to escort a convoy delivering supplies to a remote village near the border. The roads were icy, and the weather was brutal. Halfway there, we came under fire." Mira felt her breath hitch despite herself. The way Arthur spoke with calm precision and vivid detail pulled her in against her will. "It wasn't a battle," Arthur clarified. "It was an ambush. They didn't want to kill us. They wanted the supplies. Food, medicine, blankets. things that we took for granted, but that meant survival for them. My convoy was hit hard. The truck carrying the supplies was set ablaze. I remember hearing the screams of the driver as we tried to pull him out. He didn't make it. Arthur's voice faltered for a moment, but he regained his composure quickly. When the attackers left, I could have just called for reinforcements. I could have left the rest of the supplies behind and retreated to safety. But there was a woman, a mother, standing at the edge of the chaos. She had 2 children clinging to her legs, their faces hollow with hunger. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, they begged. Mira shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "So, what did you do?" "I gave her what I could," Arthur said simply. The attackers had taken most of the supplies, but there were a few crates left. I took the risk and drove them to the village myself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive for another winter. The medal I received for that mission? It wasn't for bravery or heroism. It was for doing my job, for surviving. But every time I look at it, I think of the ones I couldn't save. The driver, the others who fell that day, the ones who didn't make it through the winter. Mira stared at him, her throat dry. She had spent so much of her life shouting about systems and symbols, about collective oppression, that she had forgotten to consider the individuals caught in the storm. For the first time, she wondered if her activism lacked the nuance it needed, but she pushed the thought aside. "And yet, you still stayed in the military," Mira said, her tone accusatory. "After everything you saw, everything you experienced, you still put on that uniform and kept fighting. Why?" Arthur smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because someone has to. You may not agree with how the world works, Miss Thompson, but the truth is, it doesn't stop spinning just because we wish it would. There's always another crisis, another need, another choice to make, and I chose to serve, not because I loved war, but because I loved the people I wanted to protect." Mira opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Arthur didn't wait for her to find them. "You see, Miss Thompson," he said, standing up and picking up his hat, "service isn't about the uniform. It isn't about the medals or the politics. It's about the moments, the lives, the little things that don't make it into history books, but that matter all the same." He placed a few bills on the table to cover his coffee. "I hope you'll think about that. And if you ever want to talk again, I'll be here most mornings. Have a good day." With that, he walked out of the cafe, leaving Mira alone with her thoughts. The room seemed quieter than before, and for the first time in years, Mira found herself questioning not just her actions, but her beliefs. Arthur Miles hadn't changed her mind, not yet, but he had planted a seed, and deep down, she knew it would grow. The next morning, Mira couldn't shake the conversation she'd had with Arthur Miles. It replayed in her mind like a song on repeat, each line tugging at her thoughts in a way that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She had spent years building a persona of certainty, an unwavering advocate for justice. Yet now, for the first time, she felt an unwelcome sliver of doubt. By mid-afternoon, she found herself scrolling through her phone, searching for information about Arthur Miles. His name brought up countless articles, most of them detailing his long and storied military career. He had served in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and several humanitarian missions around the world. His accolades were numerous, and yet, despite the decorated career, every photograph of him showed the same quiet humility she had seen in the cafe. Mira sighed and closed her phone. She had a video to edit, a brand partnership to finalize, and a protest to organize for the weekend. Yet none of it felt as urgent as it usually did. The questions Arthur had posed lingered like a weight she couldn't set down. By evening, she found herself walking back to the cafe. It wasn't intentional, or at least that's what she told herself. She needed a place to think, to plan her next move. When she stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries enveloped her, and she immediately scanned the room. Arthur wasn't there. A strange mix of relief and disappointment washed over her, but she shook it off and found a seat by the window. As she sipped her latte, Her mind wandered to the stories he had told. The ambush, the little girl, the mother with hollow eyes. The details had painted such vivid images in her mind, ones she couldn't easily dismiss. Her fingers hovered over her phone, the urge to record a video confession creeping in. But what would she even say? That she had been wrong? That she had judged someone too quickly? Her followers wouldn't understand. They wouldn't forgive her for softening her stance, not when she had built her brand on absolutes. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Mira's heart skipped. Arthur walked in, the same calm presence as before. He glanced around, spotted her, and offered a small nod before heading to the counter to order his coffee. Mira hesitated, debating whether to leave before he had a chance to sit near her, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Moments later, Arthur approached her table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone as neutral as ever. Mira gestured to the chair across from her. "Go ahead," she said, trying to sound indifferent. Arthur sat down, setting his coffee cup carefully on the table. "I didn't expect to see you here again." "Neither did I," Mira admitted. "But I guess I have some questions." Arthur nodded, as though he had anticipated this. "I'm happy to answer them. But first, let me ask you something. Why does the uniform bother you so much?" Mira blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to turn the tables on her. "It's not the uniform," she said quickly. "It's what it represents. Violence, oppression, war. And you think those things define me?" Arthur asked, his voice calm but pointed. Mira hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe." Arthur took a sip of his coffee, letting her words settle between them. "Miss Thompson, you seem like someone who cares deeply about the world. That's a good thing. But let me ask you this. How do you change a world that's already broken?" Mira frowned, unsure of where he was going with this. "You fight," she said. "You speak out. You push for change." Arthur nodded. "And sometimes you serve. Not because the world is perfect, but because it isn't. Not because the people you help are always good, but because they're human." Mira stared at him, her frustration growing. "That sounds like an excuse, a way to justify doing things that hurt people." "Maybe," Arthur admitted, "but let me tell you another story. Maybe it will help you understand." Mira leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Fine. Go ahead." Arthur smiled faintly, as if he had expected her reluctance. "This was in the Gulf War," he began. "We were stationed near a refugee camp on the outskirts of Kuwait. Thousands of people had fled their homes, carrying only what they could on their backs. The conditions were horrible. No food, no clean water, no medicine. People were dying every day." He paused, his gaze distant. "One night, a young boy came to our camp. He couldn't have been older than 10. He was carrying his little sister, who was sick with a fever. He didn't speak any English, but his eyes, they told us everything we needed to know. We gave them what medicine we had, but it wasn't enough. The girl needed a hospital, and the nearest one was miles away, through dangerous territory." Arthur's voice softened. "I made a choice that night. I broke orders, took a jeep, and drove them to the hospital myself. It was risky, and if I'd been caught, it could have ended my career. But I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Mira's chest tightened. "And what happened to them?" "The girl survived," Arthur said simply, "and the boy. He grew up, became a teacher. He wrote to me years later thanking me for what I did. Said I changed his life." Mira swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She wanted to argue, to tell him that his actions didn't erase the harm caused by war, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the point. Arthur leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The world isn't black and white, Miss Thompson. It's gray, messy, complicated, and sometimes the best we can do is try to make it a little less broken." For the first time, Mira didn't have a response. She sat there, her latte forgotten, as Arthur's words settled into the deepest corners of her mind. The following days were a blur for Mira. She went through the motions of her usual routine, editing videos, engaging with her followers, attending protests, but everything felt hollow. Arthur's words had carved a space in her mind, one she couldn't seem to fill with her usual certainty. She had never questioned her beliefs before, not like this. But now, the cracks were impossible to ignore. She found herself back at the cafe 3 days later, this time with the intention of seeing Arthur again. She wasn't sure what she wanted, answers maybe, or closure, something to put her mind at ease. When she walked in, she spotted him immediately. He was seated at the same table by the window, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him, his coffee steaming beside it. Mira hesitated, debating whether to approach him. But before she could decide, he looked up and caught her gaze. He gave her the faintest of nods, an invitation she couldn't refuse. Gathering her courage, she walked over and sat down across from him. "You're back," Arthur said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again." "I wasn't sure either," Mira admitted, "but I guess I have more questions." Arthur folded his newspaper and set it aside. "I figured you might. What's on your mind?" Mira struggled to find the right words. "I guess I don't understand how you can live with it. The things you've seen, the things you've done. How do you reconcile all of it?" Arthur took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "You don't. Not really. The memories stay with you, no matter how much time passes, but you learn to carry them differently. You focus on the good you've done, the lives you've touched, and you hope it's enough to outweigh the rest." Mira frowned. But what if it's not enough? What if the harm outweighs the good? Arthur's gaze softened. "Then you live with it. You do what you can to make amends, to leave the world a little better than you found it. And you accept that you're human, that you'll make mistakes, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." Mira looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I don't know if I could do that. If I could live with that kind of guilt." Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You'd be surprised what you can live with when you don't have a choice. But it's not about the guilt, Mira. It's about the people who depend on you. The ones who don't have the luxury of waiting for someone else to step up." Mira met his gaze, her chest tightening. "Did you ever think about quitting? About walking away?" "Every day," Arthur said without hesitation. "There were times I wanted to give up, to leave it all behind. But then I'd think about the faces of the people I'd helped, the ones who wouldn't have made it without someone willing to take the risk. And I'd remember why I started in the first place." Mira nodded slowly, her thoughts a tangled mess. She wanted to understand, to make sense of the contradictions in Arthur's life. But the more she learned, the more she realized there were no easy answers. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He flipped it open and slid it across the table to her. "Here," he said. "Take a look." Mira hesitated before picking up the notebook. Inside were handwritten notes, each one a message of gratitude. Some were from fellow soldiers, others from civilians Arthur had helped over the years. One page held a child's drawing of a soldier holding hands with a little girl, a crude but heartfelt attempt to capture a moment of kindness. "These are the reminders," Arthur said quietly. "The things that keep me going when the weight feels too heavy. They're not medals or ribbons, but they mean more to me than anything else." Mira's throat tightened as she flipped through the pages. Each note, each drawing, was a testament to the impact Arthur had made. It was overwhelming, humbling in a way she hadn't expected. Arthur noticed the conflict in Mira's expression and leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. "You're young, Mira. It's natural to see the world in black and white. But as you get older, you realize that life doesn't fit neatly into those boxes. Sometimes the only thing you can do is find a way to live in the gray." Mira looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "But isn't that just an excuse? A way to justify not taking a stand?" Arthur shook his head. Not at all. Taking a stand is important, but you have to be willing to understand what you're standing against, and who you're standing for. If you can't see the humanity in people, even those you disagree with, then what are you really fighting for? His words hit Mira harder than she expected. She had always thought of herself as someone who cared deeply about humanity, about justice. But Arthur's question made her realize how often she had dismissed people as symbols, as obstacles to be torn down rather than individuals with their own stories and struggles. Arthur smiled faintly, sensing her introspection. It's not easy, I know, but the fact that you're here, asking these questions, means you're already on the right path. Growth isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask the questions. Mira nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She still didn't have the clarity she was looking for, but for the first time, she felt like she was beginning to understand what she needed to do. Mira sat in her apartment, the notebook Arthur had given her resting on her lap. She had been flipping through its pages for hours, rereading the notes and drawings, each one a fragment of a life Arthur had touched. The messages were simple but powerful, expressions of gratitude, stories of survival, and words of encouragement written by people who had seen the worst of humanity, but had also glimpsed its best. One note, written in shaky handwriting, caught her attention. It read, "To the man who carried me to safety when the world was falling apart, I will never forget you. Thank you for giving me a second chance at life." Mira's chest tightened as she read the words. She could picture the moment, the desperation and fear, the choice Arthur had made to put himself in harm's way for someone he didn't know. It was a kind of courage she couldn't fathom, one that seemed both selfless and impossible. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a notification from one of her social media platforms. A video she had posted earlier that week had gone viral, sparking a heated debate in the comments. Normally, she would have dived in, eager to defend her stance and engage with her followers. But now, the thought of doing so felt exhausting. What could she say that would matter? That would make a difference. She glanced back at the notebook, at the stories it held. They weren't grand declarations or sweeping movements. They were small, personal moments of impact. And for the first time, Mira wondered if she had been going about her activism all wrong. The next morning, Mira found herself back at the cafe, the notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't know if Arthur would be there, but she needed to talk to him, to tell him what she had realized. When she walked in, her heart sank. His usual spot by the window was empty. She approached the barista, a friendly woman with curly red hair. "Excuse me," Mira said. "The man who usually sits by the window, Arthur, do you know if he's coming in today?" The barista's smile faltered. "Arthur? Oh, you mean the veteran? He hasn't been in for a few days. Is everything okay?" Mira's stomach churned. She thanked the barista and left the cafe, her mind racing. She didn't know much about Arthur's life outside their conversations, but the thought of not seeing him again filled her with a sense of urgency. She had to find him. Over the next few days, Mira searched for Arthur. She visited the Veterans Center downtown, checked with local shelters, and even asked around the neighborhood. Each time she was met with kind but unhelpful responses. No one seemed to know where he was. Finally, she returned to the cafe, hoping for some sort of miracle. As she sat by the window, staring out at the bustling street, she heard the door jingle behind her. Turning around, she saw him. Arthur, wearing his usual calm expression, his hat tucked under his arm. Relief flooded through her as she stood to greet him. "Arthur," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been looking for you." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Looking for me? Why?" Mira hesitated, unsure how to put her thoughts into words. She held up the notebook. I've been reading through it, and I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me." Arthur gestured for her to sit down, taking the seat across from her. "I'm glad to hear that. What did you figure out?" Mira took a deep breath. I've spent so much time trying to change the world by shouting at it, by forcing people to see things my way. But your stories, they showed me something different. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or loud protests. Sometimes it comes from the quiet things, the small acts of kindness that ripple outward. Arthur nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's true. The big battles matter, but so do the small ones. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up for one person, in one moment. Mira's eyes filled with tears. I think I've been so focused on being right that I forgot why I started in the first place. I wanted to help people, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. Arthur reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. It's never too late to find your way back. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. Finally, Arthur spoke again. Mira, the world needs people like you, people who care enough to fight for what they believe in. But it also needs people who are willing to listen, to understand. Don't lose that. Mira nodded, her resolve strengthening. I won't. As they parted ways that day, Mira felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She didn't have all the answers. She probably never would. But she knew she wanted to be better, to do better. And that was enough. A week after her last conversation with Arthur, Mira found herself standing on a stage in a modest community center. The crowd in front of her wasn't the vast digital audience she was used to. There were no likes, no comments, no share buttons. Instead, there were a few dozen faces, each one turned toward her with quiet curiosity. They were here to hear her speak, to share her journey, and Mira felt a weight of responsibility she hadn't experienced before. The event had been organized by the local Veterans Center. Mira had reached out to them after her meeting with Arthur, wanting to learn more, to connect with the people whose lives she had only glimpsed through his notebook. They had welcomed her with open arms, inviting her to share her story as part of their community outreach program. She had hesitated at first, unsure if her voice belonged in such a space, but Arthur had encouraged her, reminding her that understanding began with listening and sharing. Mira took a deep breath as she stepped up to the microphone. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. I'll be honest, I don't think I ever imagined myself in a room like this, speaking to people like you. Not because I don't respect you, but because I didn't understand you. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. For a long time, I saw the world in black and white. I thought I knew who the heroes were, who the villains were, and what the solutions should be. I thought being loud, being certain, was the only way to make a difference. But then I met someone who showed me how wrong I was. She told them about Arthur, about the first time she saw him in the cafe, about her harsh judgment, and about the stories he had shared with her. She spoke about the notebook and the lives it represented, about the quiet acts of courage and kindness that had rippled outward in ways she had never considered. Arthur taught me that change doesn't always come from grand gestures, she said. Sometimes it's the small things, the moments that don't make it into history books, but matter deeply to the people who live them. He showed me that understanding and empathy are just as important as action, and that true service often comes at a personal cost. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mira felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed through, her voice steady. I'm here today because I want to do better. I want to listen, to learn, and to use whatever platform I have to amplify the voices of people like Arthur, people who have lived lives of sacrifice and service, who have stories that deserve to be heard. After her speech, there was a quiet round of applause, warm and genuine. A few people approached her afterward to thank her for her words, sharing their own stories of service and struggle. For the first time, Mira felt a sense of connection that went beyond the screen of her phone, a feeling that she was part of something real, something meaningful. Arthur was there, sitting in the back of the room. As the crowd began to disperse, he approached her, his expression calm but proud. "You did well," he said simply. Mira smiled, the warmth of his approval settling over her like a blanket. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Arthur shook his head. "You had it in you all along. You just needed a little push." They sat together for a while, talking quietly as the room emptied. Mira told him about her plans to shift her focus, to use her platform to highlight stories of resilience and hope, to bridge the gap between the loud battles she had been fighting and the quiet ones she now understood were just as important. "I think you'll do great," Arthur said, his tone as steady as ever. "Just remember, change takes time, and it's okay to start small." Mira nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she left the community center that evening, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to care enough to keep trying, to keep showing up. Arthur's words stayed with her, a quiet reminder of the power of small acts, of the importance of showing up. And as Mira moved forward, she carried his lessons with her, knowing that the journey she had begun was only the beginning.